When the soldiers who had been forced to join the Neal family's forces were cornered by the Dawn Alliance, they suddenly realized that they were surrounded by people just like them. Both sides were dissatisfied with the way the Neal family treated them. The Neal family soldiers decided to rebel against them. "We're all on the same side," one soldier said to a Dawn Alliance member. "We were all exploited by the Neal family." "Down with the Neal family!" another shouted. Most of the people who had been forced to join the Neal family had resentment in their hearts, and there was finally a way to vent this resentment. There was also a legitimate hope for redemption from their predicament, which excited them greatly. They began to turn against the Neal family one after another. Charles smiled at Olivia and the other commanders. "Like I said before, a motley crowd is just a motley crowd," he said. "There's nothing to worry about." In theory, the Neal family strategy hadn't been particularly bad, but the one big mistake they had made was to expand their numbers when the enemy was already in front of them. Kevin sighed and said, "I didn't expect that they'd act like an angry mob instead of an army. If the people in the apocalypse are like this, then we might as well let this world be destroyed." "There are still good people in the world, but there are very few of them left," Lena said. "Whether a world gets lighter or darker depends on the people who stand at the top, and whether they compromise with the darkness or fight it to the end," Charles said. "Kevin, if you stand at the top of the world, of course you can make it into what you want it to be." Kevin smiled bitterly and said, "Sounds like a great plan." "Forget it," Charles said. "It's still too early to talk about this. We have work to finish." He brought his men closer to the enemy. At that moment, the Neals could finally see the disadvantage of using force to coerce their men. As long as the enemy could trigger the rebelliousness in their minds, they were vulnerable. And now, the Neals were surrounded. Kevin came to the front door of the Neal family's residence and shouted, "The Neal family doesn't care about their soldiers. Quit hiding away like a coward, George. I thought you were supposed to be in charge." George opened the door and shouted at Kevin, "Bastard! You still have the gall to call yourself a member of the Neal family after what you've done? How did our family give birth to such a traitor? We took so much time to nurture you, yet you don't serve us in return. Instead, you colluded with outsiders and destroyed our family." "I don't care what kind of foundation you want to build," Kevin said coldly. "Your actions are subhuman. You do whatever you want just because you have the power to get away with it. You wantonly abuse women. Your behavior is even worse than that of a beast. I should be the one who's ashamed to be associated with you." George pointed at Kevin and trembled in anger. "People who achieve great things don't care about trifles. Besides, how would I know about such things? If there were people who committed crimes, how would I forgive them?" Kevin said in a deep voice, "None of this matters anymore. We've already informed the military, and they've stabilized the situation. They'll send people to save the women soon. Then they'll identify the criminals, and none will be able to escape. If you think you're innocent, then just accept their inspection." When they heard that the military was coming, before George could even get angry, a few of their men burst into tears. "We didn't do it on purpose," one said. "The Neals forced us to join them." "We're all victims," another whimpered. "How else can we do such horrible things? If we don't do what they say, they won't let us go. We were all forced." Following their lead, even more people began to cry, while other people around them separated from them. There were even a few people who became snitches in order to get away with their own crimes. "Yes, it's him," one man said, pointing at Sebastian. "He forced us to do this." Sebastian's face went deathly pale as so many people accused him. One person pointed at an old man in the Neal family. "My brother was beaten to death by this old bastard just like that." Another person said, "The day before yesterday, a few people went out to find a box of instant noodles and 2 boxes of mineral water. Then he brought people to raid the house. He saw that there was a pretty woman inside. She was in front of her husband." "Ah, I'm that woman," said another. "These beasts are simply not human. My son just wanted to join another organization, and these animals from the Neal family sent people to kill him. Then they destroyed the organization. It was this heartless animal who was behind it all." As the crimes were identified, the morale of the crowd grew stronger. While things were looking dire for the Neals, not long ago, they had been dreaming of dominating the world. But in an instant, they'd fallen to the point where thousands of people were pointing fingers at them. The huge disparity was a decisive blow. Meanwhile, George's face was livid. "You think this is our fault?" he roared. "This is the fault of this world we live in. If we want to survive, we can only unify. I just want to bring everyone together. Are my methods wrong? Or are you guys just not willing to make the sacrifices needed to survive?" "Only children can talk about right and wrong in such a simplistic manner," Charles said, as he slowly walked in front of everyone. "We only care about one thing. We want to live, and you don't want us to." "Don't lecture me about right and wrong." Charles's exclamation took George completely by surprise, but he took a step forward. "There are so many monsters outside now," George said. "We should unite just like before. If we don't, the monsters will pick us off one by one. Do you think your people are stronger than our soldiers?" Charles interrupted him. "You spread panic in the camp in order to disrupt the military's order," he said accusingly. "You even killed soldiers to protect the people. Your actions led to the deaths of more than 8,000 people. The chain reaction you initiated caused the military's stability to collapse. Is this what you call unity?" George was at a loss for words. He was usually prepared to fight back, but with so many witnesses, he couldn't hurt Charles. When the surrounding crowd heard Charles's accusations, they looked at the Neal family in disgust. Most of the spectators had themselves been rescued by the military, and the Neal family's actions demonstrated the worst of humanity. Charles approached George. As he did, he said, "Although I don't like what you've done, I can still understand your actions. But I don't know how you can sleep at night knowing that you've sacrificed so many people for the sake of such a small minority." Now that he had pushed all the issues regarding the military onto the Neal family, no one objected. Many people had done things that they were ashamed of in the name of the army, but now that someone was able to become a scapegoat, they weren't about to acknowledge their own wrongdoings. The guilty ones realized that the Neal family were going to be wiped out anyway. Privately, Charles thought the Neal family's plan hadn't been bad. He had experienced the apocalypse for 10 years, and he had to acknowledge that his own schemes hadn't been much better than theirs. But he did contend that his moral foundation was a little stronger. He had always risked his own life to deal with monsters instead of harming others or making them do the work for him. George looked at Kevin. "You're a member of our family," he said with contempt. "Do you think your actions have been worthy of your ancestors? Will you stand there on Judgment Day and defend the fact that you taught sacred cultivation techniques to outsiders?" George had already lost his power, so his only option was to try and deflect by drawing attention to Kevin's faults. In his mind, image was more important than actions. "The ancestors passed down a rule that disciples of the family have to work hard for their success," Kevin recited. "But when they do accumulate wealth or power, they should never forget that family is the greatest measure of success. The only one violating the Neal family's ancestral rule is you. What right do you have to criticize me?" George threw his head back and laughed loudly. "You're such a good kid," he exclaimed. "You really are a lot like your father." Kevin's expression turned dark. "Where is my father?" "Don't worry," George assured him. "I don't threaten my enemy's parents. However, I also can't allow outsiders to interfere in our family's business. How about this? Fight me fairly, one-on-one. If you win, you'll be the new head of the family. If you lose, I walk away." Charles was very dubious about allowing the old tradition to go ahead. It was obvious that George had given up any hope of survival, but that he still wanted to throw down a challenge as though he were still the respected head of the family. He wanted to perform one last grand act before he died. However, Charles also knew that there was a degree of sacred glory that had been passed down by the ancient martial arts families for thousands of years. It was the reason they were so proud. He considered that it wasn't his place to object to the fight, so he remained silent and left the matter to Kevin. "All right," Kevin said, taking a few steps forward. "I agree." But Charles pulled him back. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered. "We have the upper hand right now. You don't need to act like a hero." "I'm not acting like a hero," Kevin replied, offended. "It's just that the family secrets I can provide to you all are limited, and the help I can provide is too. If I become the head of the family, I can change things. I can share more of the family's knowledge with whoever I want. Can you just trust me on this? The loyalty from those branches of the family also means we can increase our numbers, and I can protect more people." "That's great," Charles said. "But have you thought about the consequences if you lose?" Kevin smiled. "You'll step in and save me if I lose," he said simply. "I just want to see the old jerk lose his dignity on top of everything else. This is about defending my convictions, not boosting my ego." Charles let out a sigh of relief. Kevin was a person who was passionate about defending his beliefs. He was willing to risk his life for them. Charles respected him for that because he knew it was about honor and not pride. Charles himself had never cared much about the old rules and regulations. He knew they didn't have any binding power over the individual or make someone less of a martial artist for not respecting them. To him, results were the most important thing. Even with the guarantee of Charles's protection, Kevin still faced considerable peril. But he was a strong man with a gentle heart, and he was neither afraid nor intimidated by the prospect of danger. Thus, everyone surrounded the two men in anticipation of the fight. The members of the Neal family looked at George with anticipation. They still had naive fantasies that, if he defeated Kevin, there was hope for them to make a comeback. This wasn't because they were stupid, but because of the way in which they were raised. The strong were respected. This conviction was practically engraved into their bones. George threw Kevin a sword, and he also procured one for himself. "I know you're good with a sword," he said. "It just so happens that I am too. How about we see who's better?" Kevin shook his head sadly and sighed. "The essence of ancient martial arts isn't in weapon skill, but rather in mastering our ancestors' techniques and applying them to the present times," he said. "This was always your problem, George. You just aren't modern enough. You might be living in the new era, but you still have an old-fashioned way of fighting. What a sad disappointment that is." "Don't pretend to be enlightened," George said with a snort of derision. "I'd like to see just how much energy you have considering you're so advanced with the times." As he spoke, a powerful aura erupted around his body. Air currents swirled around him like heat waves. The edges of his longsword seemed to shimmer and separate space. A spectator beside Olivia was shocked. "Kevin needs to be careful," they whispered to her. "That sword energy will be able to cut straight through his superpower. A direct hit could be fatal." "Yes," another onlooker agreed. "These ancient martial artists aren't to be messed with." Some paranormals were occasionally proud or arrogant. When this was the case, they often didn't even take the bio-altered paranormals seriously. They felt that it was stronger to be elementally awakened. However, if they ever found themselves up against the ancient martial artists from the Neal family, even the most arrogant paranormal lost their pride. Realizing that George had upped the ante, the crowd became even more excited. Most of them were ordinary people who had no ability to awaken. Therefore, using ancient martial arts was the only way they could see a future for themselves. There was also a level of morbid curiosity to see the peak damage an ancient martial artist could inflict. Charles looked quickly at Kevin. He knew that he wanted to set a precedent for his people. All the spectators knew it would be a big fight. Regardless of the outcome, the battle would demonstrate the peak level achievable by an ancient warrior, as well as determine the patriarch of the Neal family. Their performances would either solidify or crush the confidence of all those who practice ancient martial arts. George raised his sword, and sand and stones around his feet scattered everywhere as he released a vast amount of energy. He released 3 extremely sharp sword energies at the same time. The one in the middle was intended to cut Kevin in half, while the 2 on either side of it aimed to block his escape route. Apart from the 3 main sword energies, there were also some scattered energies that stung the onlookers. "Why am I bleeding?" someone asked, feeling as if his face had been nicked with a blade. He reached up and touched it, and he was shocked to discover that there was a small wound there. The onlookers were more than 20 feet away from the center of the battle, gaping in awe at the fact that the dispersed air currents could generate such a huge amount of force. Several of the closer audience members retreated further away in shock. However, although there was a significant amount of fear on their faces, a fanaticism appeared in their eyes. Is this the power of the ancient martial artists? They wondered. He's just as strong as a paranormal. There was dead silence as every non-awakened human wondered the same collective thought. Can I become that powerful too? The 3 streams of sword energy flew toward Kevin, displacing a channel of sand and stones in their wake. Kevin didn't dodge them. Instead, he raised his hand, and the sword energy in the middle disappeared. He allowed the other 2 energies to brush past him harmlessly. With complete ease, he had mitigated George's thunderous strike. George didn't seem to be in a hurry to attack him again. Instead, he said, "Because my strength has increased so much during this new era, I'm somewhat unable to control it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have seen that move coming." His words made some members of the crowd sigh and roll their eyes, thinking that he was making excuses for his failed attack. After all, they had just watched Kevin wave away his sword energy attack as if it were nothing. However, Charles knew that what George said was true. The attack should have been invisible and soundless, but the ancient martial artists, like paranormals, had been affected by the new era, and they were occasionally unable to control their powers properly. "Kevin, don't you want to show me how strong you are?" George shouted. He slashed out 3 more sword beams. However, this time, he also launched his own sword at him. If Kevin used the same method to cancel out the sword energy, then he would still be struck with the sword himself. A direct hit from it would destroy him. After briefly assessing the situation, Charles's people worried about Kevin. Charles himself looked nervous and subtly prepared to step in if he was needed. Kevin used his right leg to take half a step back, lowering his center of gravity slightly. His left arm rose high, and his right hand drew back at his waist in a fist. He prepared to absorb the sword energy. Seeing his seemingly foolish response, the Niels' soldiers cackled in delight. "Idiot," George spat. Using a fist to directly receive the sword energy seemed to be an incomparably foolish method. Even if he could shatter the sword energy with a fist, it would only consume a little bit of George's true energy, and Kevin would certainly be injured by the rebound. However, the tittering crowd was interjected by a faint roar. Several of them weren't sure what they had heard. "What was that?" someone asked. "What's that noise?" They thought they had heard something, but there seemed to be no source for the sound. It made them feel like they were hallucinating. Kevin slowly pushed out his right fist. The approaching sword energy seemed to move in slow motion. "As I said," he said calmly, "we inherit our techniques from our ancestors, but the best way to respect that inheritance isn't to copy it. We should merge it with the new era and then improve it." A dragon-shaped shadow appeared on his fist. The shadow burst forth and shattered the sword energies. It soared into the sky and then flew straight in George's direction. "What is this?" George cried. He turned pale with fright. Then he hurriedly recalled his own sword and used it to pierce the phantom dragon. However, the sword seemed to have no effect on the shadowy beast. It circled him and then descended on him in a blur of motion. The surrounding crowd let out a cry of surprise, and then they erupted into whispers of amazement. "That was so cool! I want to learn it too! Was that the subduing dragon technique?" Kevin's move looked similar to a special effect from an old TV series. But anyone who had a clear memory of the show knew that the apparition was something entirely different. "He used a dragon-shaped energy attack," someone mused. "How is that possible?" The crowd fell silent. The bio-altered paranormals were all shocked. None of the ordinary people had ever seen a move like that before, but with their awakened knowledge, the paranormals recognized the technique. The move was called the Dragon Energy Technique, and only those paranormals who had reached the 5th step were qualified enough to learn it. Even those at level 5 who met the minimum requirements to harness enough energy to use it had to go through repeated practice in order not to hurt themselves. However, Kevin had conjured it, not a paranormal, but an ancient martial artist. "Is he a 5th level master?" someone asked timidly. His voice rang out clearly in the silence. Many paranormals trembled, particularly those who were a little arrogant. They considered themselves above ordinary humans, and even the appearance of powerful martial artists didn't typically influence their opinion regarding their status. But the direction the battle had taken had begun to create a crack in their lofty beliefs. Suddenly, they were aware that the distance between themselves and ordinary people was no longer the insurmountable chasm that it had been. The evidence was clear. When ancient martial artists reached the pinnacle of their performance. They were comparable to paranormals. But Kevin hadn't actually reached the 5th level. His mastery was due to the fact that he had been practicing martial arts since he was young. His understanding of the principles of true energy far surpassed that of ordinary people. When he had originally discovered the existence of the Dragon Energy technique, he had used every resource available to research the move and perfect it. Once he had harnessed it, it had sparked his desire to create his own form of martial arts. Awed by Kevin's performance, the eyes of every ordinary person present shone with reverence. They all knew that it meant the cultivation techniques they were learning held real potential to be not only practical, but incredible. Some of them salivated at the thought that, if they worked hard enough, they could be compared to paranormals. Suddenly, a fire dragon appeared in Charles's hand and flew toward Kevin. There was a collective gasp when everyone saw the fiery dragon leave Charles's hand. "What's he doing?" someone shrieked. "Someone stop him!" In the wake of the sudden attack, some of them wondered whether Charles was jealous of Kevin and the potential threat he represented. But their doubts were quickly dispelled. The flaming dragon brushed past Kevin harmlessly and swept toward a hidden figure who had been approaching him from behind. The silent assassin screamed loudly as Charles's dragon turned him into a human fireball. That was when everyone realized that the man had been trying to sneak up and attack Kevin. Charles had taken out a potential threat. "Despicable," someone said about the attempted attack. "Sore loser." The crowd's irritation at Charles was quickly transferred to the cowardly attacker, and then it moved to the Neal family in general, denouncing them as cowards and cheats. The fiery dragon energy flew past Kevin again without harming him at all. It soared around him a few times, and then both it and Kevin's shadow dragon energy disappeared with 2 puffs of smoke. Kevin looked at George's body. He had died the second he had come into contact with the dragon energy. "How times have changed," Kevin said quietly to the deceased head of the family. "It looks like I'm the future of the Neal family now." He reached out his hand and gently closed George's eyes. He had barely done so when the body disintegrated into ashes. George's followers looked at Kevin and Charles with fear in their eyes. George had previously defeated the combined forces of several paranormals. They were all at a loss about how Kevin could have defeated such an expert so easily. "Charles unleashed fire that looks like a dragon," they thought. "How powerful is he?" Kevin chose to ignore their shock, and he addressed the Neal family instead. "From now on, I'm in charge of everything when it comes to running the family," he declared. "Does anyone have any objections?" Every member of the family, including all their followers, swiftly knelt on the ground to show their acceptance of him as the new head of the family. Despite their personal feelings toward Kevin, the others had no room to refute him. The rules of the battle had been made clear from the beginning. Kevin hadn't anticipated the family would accept the regime change so quickly. He had imagined several of them would take issue with his leadership or challenge him for authority. He was also somewhat remorseful of George's passing. He knew the old man had simply made a mistake by challenging him. They had needed to depose George, but he had been reluctant to turn their conflict into a death match. However, he had to consider that if he hadn't faced him in broad daylight with all the people there to witness the battle, it was very likely that George may have ambushed him in the dead of night, or else resorted to assassination. The Neal family now knew that they had backed the wrong horse. Not only that, but they had also misjudged the situation terribly. Because they were so used to following George's outdated ideas, they had neglected to move with the times and consider the current era. When they reflected on the matter, it seemed obvious that George's fall had been inevitable. Aware of the fact that he had just displayed practically invincible might, Kevin shouted to the crowd, "In this new and dangerous era, everyone has to unite to survive. I'm not referring to a selective unity that benefits only one single ambitious person, but to the type of relationship that ensures every person has a friend who they can call brother, sister, or friend. Someone you consider worth fighting for. I want us to be able to fight side by side and trust each other." The Dawn Alliance members smirked. "Is he going to give a speech?" one of them whispered with a grin. "He's going to put Charles out of business." Several of the other members snickered, but they agreed that Kevin was on their side and had the capability to bring an entire army into the alliance. So they decided to let him do as he pleased. The paranormals have power that vastly outstrips that of ordinary people, Kevin continued. I'm not asking you all to use that power to protect ordinary people, but I'm asking that you consider the fact that even ordinary people, as long as they have a strong will, can still exert great power. His words resonated with many of the assembled people. A vast number of them have been bullied by paranormals at some point. The reason the cultivation methods had spread so quickly among them was because they wanted to take back some of their power. As a result, many so-called ordinary people had the ambition to work their way up to a level that was on par with the paranormals, so they could stand up to them. Since Kevin represented the pinnacle of martial arts performance for the cultivators, his latest demonstration had firmly secured his place in their minds as their idol. What he said next, though, was enough to change the minds of several people. Right now, Kevin said, I'm about to establish a brand new order. I don't know what this world will become in the future, but I do know that only those who build their own power and social connections will survive. Anyone who is planning to rely on others to protect them, wants to sit on their ass and not pull their weight, isn't going to last long in this world. His words prompted a wave of complaints and protests. Easy for you to say. Do you think we want to be like this? We need to awaken and have power. We're just ordinary people. No matter how hard we try, we can't catch up to paranormals. No one trusts him. He just wants to persuade us to work for the paranormals. Some among the crowd were silent, and others were in deep thought. Many of them cursed at Kevin before they left the battlefield. Kevin felt a little puzzled. I only told them the truth, he thought. In this new era, people couldn't survive by relying on the protection of others. He knew it was a fact that those who were destined to do well and survive were the ones who could rely on their own determination and skills. Those who can't help themselves can't help anyone, he thought. It's ridiculously entitled to think someone else is going to keep you alive. However, he noticed one thing, and that was the members of the Dawn Alliance. Their eyes shone with hope. It was as if they were moved by him. Charles approached Kevin and clapped a hand on his shoulder. You don't need fancy words to make a good speech, he said. You just need to appeal to the people's emotions. You had them at the beginning, but you hit a sore spot for a lot of people at the end. They don't want to admit that they're weak, and they really don't want to be called out on it. Something clicked in Kevin's mind. Are you saying you think I'm right about how some of them were thinking? He asked. Olivia took the opportunity to reply. Believe it or not, most people just want to fly under the radar and not fight at all. To them, just being alive and plodding around all day is the best thing in the world. Unless it's a real life or death situation, most of them aren't going to take the initiative to train or fight. Kevin lowered his head. Sorry, he said sheepishly. I didn't think they'd react like that. No, you did well, Charles exclaimed in delight. Anyone who wants to prove their worth is here. You got rid of exactly the type of people I didn't want here to begin with. Kevin felt that his speech had been a failure, but Charles thought it was a success in disguise. Charles understood one thing well, and that was not everyone was designed to thrive in the new era. He knew that some people were content to find a safe environment and simply live as normally as possible while they waited for death. He could even see how they might feel like they were living a good life. But he also knew that those who didn't want to improve themselves were destined to die sooner rather than later, particularly if they were too lazy to hunt for themselves. When Charles had established the Dawn Alliance, he had seen no benefit in winning over the people's hearts. For one thing, he wasn't an endearing person. And for another, the exchange system he had set up was designed to give people the chance to improve themselves. Those who had joined the Dawn Alliance at the beginning, apart from those who had ulterior motives, were all survivors. In Charles's opinion, Kevin's speech had eliminated the weak. It had hit a sore spot for most people, and this had created resentment. However, it meant that Charles was left with the types of people he wanted in his ranks. He was sure there were some good leaders who might be willing to use some resources to keep people with no interest in improving or assisting the community around. But Charles wasn't one of them. He had neither the time nor the patience, and he considered such people a waste of food and supplies. Suddenly, the army arrived. Fashionably late, Charles thought dryly. Their delay wasn't due to inefficiency, but because there were a great number of survivors in the area they controlled. When the insects had attacked, the Army's casualties had been the lowest number in the fortress. If it weren't for the fact that someone in the Neal family had caused trouble, the Army might have kept their total fatalities under 1%. When Charles saw the soldiers up close, he noticed that they had undergone obvious changes. Their eyes were bloodshot, and they looked like they wanted to spit fire. When they had interrogated the Neal family, they had used several unapproved methods without mercy. It wasn't how they would ordinarily conduct themselves, but the deaths of tens of thousands of people had taught them a painful lesson. They had discovered that if they showed mercy to criminals, it devalued the lives of those they had harmed or killed. Charles gave a silent sigh of relief. It was better the military change now and reduce potential future tragedies. The Dawn Alliance welcomed a new wave of recruits. Charles had originally planned to take his people away that day because he knew the swarm of insects would continue to attack. However, once he saw the opportunity to expand, he then decided to take the risk and stay for another day. Although he knew taking the risk was a little heartless, he also knew that it wasn't the time to be soft-hearted. During the recruitment process, he told Olivia to make it clear that everyone who joined the Dawn Alliance was obligated to fight monsters. Ordinary people would fight ordinary monsters in order to save the paranormals' energy for the mutated ones. Anyone who didn't accept this rule was rejected. If Charles had set the rule at the beginning, he might have struggled to recruit anyone. Now that people had seen his recent displays of power, though, no one objected. Some of the Dawn Alliance harbored ill feelings toward the Neal family. Several of them considered the family disloyal because they had been all but forcefully recruited. They also ran into a completely different type of problem. "What should we do about partners?" Olivia asked Charles. "Partners?" he asked blankly. "Several people in the Alliance have family members or partners who aren't physically able to fight," she explained. "They've offered to pull the weight for a family member or friend in return for their place here. How do you want to deal with it?" Charles thought for a moment, and then he said, "If someone isn't willing to fight, they still need to play their part. For example, they can learn and carry out medical skills, food preparation, or weapons cleaning and testing. But ultimately, their survival is up to themselves or the person who's decided to vouch for them. This includes being responsible for their food if the person doesn't hunt, forage, or cook it. If that's clear, there's no problem." Tina frowned and said, "Are you sure about this? You just made a point of saying we don't take in anyone who doesn't fight, and now you're creating loopholes. Aren't you being a little hypocritical?" "I just want people to be responsible for themselves and their own survival," Charles said succinctly. "Not everyone is capable of fighting, I get that. But I'm not apologizing for putting people in dangerous situations when I've made it extremely clear what we're doing and what the outcome is likely to be. If a member feels strongly enough to want someone with them who doesn't fight, that's their prerogative. But neither I nor anyone else is going to be held accountable for that person's safety." Olivia interjected. "It also might help stimulate people's protective instincts," she said. "Not to mention retain some of their humanity." Tina fell silent, but Charles could tell she was furious. She was a strong-willed woman, and she was a firm advocate of the self-sufficiency rule. "Listen," he said to her gently, "it can be easy for people with excessive strength, like the paranormals, to behave irrationally. Tensions are always high these days. I'm not going to deny people a little bit of happiness at having their loved ones with them, or even just some company on the road. Not if they're willing to look out for them and it keeps them from rebelling. I'm not being compassionate, I'm being tactical. If the soldiers are happy, then they're happy to fight." Tina nodded and finally accepted the decision. Alliance members who had been eavesdropping were delighted. Many of them relied on their advanced strength and prowess to attract partners. They knew their physical advancements made them as appealing as millionaires had been in the old era. Charles added a warning. "Make no mistake, I won't tolerate coercion or bad behavior of any kind here. If you're bringing anyone in from the outside, it's on the assumption you're treating them well. Any incidents of mistreatment will be dealt with accordingly." The paranormal eavesdroppers quickly launched into a flurry of agreement. "Don't worry," one of them cried. "We'd never do that." "I hope not," Charles replied. "Other than that, go about your business." Charles knew precisely why the Alliance members wanted him to allow a certain number of non-essential people. After all, they were all adults who were ultimately responsible for their own lives. He saw no point in trying to force them all into celibacy or solitude. He had no intention of going against human nature. Instead, he wanted to encourage humanity and a sense of respect for others. He knew well that if a person had someone to rely on, or someone they wanted to protect, it retained their humanity and could even encourage them to work harder. The Dawn Alliance's recruitment process thrived. The total number of members broke 8,000, which was around the upper limit of the figure that Charles had estimated for the survival base. Olivia wasn't entirely happy with the inflated numbers, because various major and minor powers were already establishing themselves within the fortress. Ordinary people once again looked to paranormals or ancient martial artists to protect them from the organizations, some of which had more than 1,000 recruits. However, even though she was weary of the shady dealings, she knew that it was important they recruit people who were motivated above those who weren't. She had to admit that Charles and Kevin had done a good job ensuring they were surrounded by people who wanted to use their own strength to survive. It was better than those who had been part of the Neal family's motley crew. "Tomorrow we'll set out to find our new base," Charles told her. Their numbers were right on target, and he had several good spots in mind that he wanted to check out. In his previous life, he had established a survival base that had provided protection for more than 80,000 people. Thinking back to his former life and what had happened at the base filled him with a mix of sadness and rage. Once he had established safety in his old base, he had offered shelter to a number of homeless people and vagabonds. However, several of them had betrayed him. Even the charity cases who had been sincere and had supported him at all costs had been almost completely wiped out during the rebellion. That incident was the reason he was no longer willing to accept those who had no intention to fight, help themselves, or be part of the community. He knew that when the going got rough, they would turn on him and everyone else too. Seeing him so lost in thought, Alice and Sylvia knew better than to ask what was on his mind. They were often mystified by his sudden mood swings, but they understood that it was obviously something that made him the complicated person that he was. As he reminisced, Lena and Harper approached, leading a girl dressed in ragged clothes by their side. "Alice, please save her," Lena said anxiously. Alice cast a healing spell on the girl and washed away the mud on her face. Then she recognized the wretched figure. "Penelope," she cried, "what are you doing here?" A long time ago, Charles, Blair, and Harper had saved Penelope and had taken her to the fortress. Once there, she had fallen for a man and had all but abandoned her friends. However, Harper and the others hadn't held it against her because they knew it was just how life sometimes went. Seeing her in her present state, though, was a shock to them all. Blair rushed to Penelope's side and asked with concern, "What happened to you?" Seeing herself surrounded by familiar friends, Penelope burst into tears. She managed to calm herself down and recount her sorry story. The man she had fallen for was a paranormal, but he had no interest in being with her in the long term. He had toyed with her affection and had cheated on her several times, relying on her feelings of powerlessness to keep her with him. She had felt so ashamed and worthless that she hadn't been able to find the courage to approach her friends for help, and she had decided to endure her situation. She had then resigned herself to the fact that he would at least keep her safe. But when the bugs had attacked the fortress, her abusive protector had been killed. She had therefore relied on the techniques she had learned from Charles to escape and survive. But she had barely escaped the danger when she had encountered the Neal family. They had promised her sanctuary, but they had treated her brutally. Once she finished recounting the nightmare, Lena hugged her sympathetically. Harper, Tina, and the others felt even more determined to ensure their own independence. Alice was glad that she had found Charles and that he was reliable, but she was also grateful that she had reached Tier 4 strength and was an expert fighter in her own right. However, when Charles saw Penelope, he frowned slightly. When Alice noticed his expression, she pulled him aside. "Is there a problem?" she demanded quietly. "Do you think she's lying? Look at her." Alice was no longer the kind of person who would rush to the aid of every pitiful person who crossed her path. She knew that there wasn't anything to be gained by offering charity, but she was conflicted because Penelope was a friend. Charles shook his head. "She's not lying," he agreed, "and she's obviously had a rough time." "Then what is it?" Alice asked. In her opinion, Penelope was a victim, and although it was true that she could be a little vain, she was still a good person. "Do you remember Elliot Johnson?" Charles asked her. "He treated me like a brother in the old days." Alice's face turned pale. She understood Charles's concerns. She reminded him, however, that Elliot's jealousy had been the catalyst for his betrayal. He had also threatened Charles's family, which wasn't true of Penelope. She was a victim and had done nothing wrong except trust the wrong man. However, Charles had no sympathy. He sighed. "She's exactly the same," he insisted. "Who knows? If she's left alone, she might become a threat." Alice was annoyed. "All right," she said. "So, what are you going to tell Lena?" Charles was suddenly trapped. Alice had found his only weakness. If there was one thing that could make Charles hesitate, it was the love he had for his sister. In the end, Charles decided to put his suspicions aside. If it weren't for Lena, he would have turned Penelope away in a heartbeat. But he knew his sister would never forgive him for rejecting one of her friends. He knew it also might make him look bad in the eyes of his people, and he decided ultimately that Penelope's presence wasn't worth losing his alliance's loyalty over. However, he did remind Harper and Lena to be more vigilant with who they brought home. The military and Kevin's interrogation of the Neal family was almost over. Everyone in the family, except for those in prison, was killed. Those who had been imprisoned were people who hadn't seen eye to eye with George. After Kevin had helped deal with his family, he asked for a word with Charles. "George found a spring," he said. "The water there is very clean, and it could slightly increase the drinker's vitality. It doesn't harm the body in any way. To hide its whereabouts, he and his supporters killed everyone who knew about it in the 2 towns nearby." Kevin's jaw was tight, and he clenched his fists at the thought of the injustice. He was a man of the world and no stranger to evil. His own family had sacrificed him for power, after all. But he had never heard of such a despicable thing as murdering inhabitants of multiple towns to protect the location of some water. During peaceful times, there would have been a scandal and an outrage over such a blatant massacre. However, because of the apocalypse, George and his cronies had gone unpunished. Charles didn't know how to console him. He tried to sound sympathetic. "The dead are gone," he said gently. "What's important is that we move on and learn to survive." Charles's mind was racing at the news of the spring. Before the apocalypse in his previous life, a spring had appeared in the middle of the Sahara Desert and had created an oasis where people had been able to survive the harsh climate. He knew that these springs were places where vital energy gathered. It would be suitable locations for a survival base. His initial plan had been to look for a spring that had been discovered in his previous life, but in his current existence, it hadn't yet materialized. News of this new water source would save him a lot of time and effort. He noticed that Kevin was looking at him with a strange expression. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked. "I think you've experienced something like this before," Kevin said seriously. "That's why you're so numb to everything. You seem to have no morals, but in fact you have a very accurate understanding of the human heart. People say you're a cold-blooded killer, but I think you kill only when you think it's necessary. You're more decisive than anyone I know." Kevin knew that Charles was incredibly unwavering when it came to killing. Even Kevin himself sometimes hesitated before taking a life. Charles appeared to do it with more ease than any normal person should. In reality, Charles had never killed anyone he deemed to be a good person. His cruelty was reserved for his enemies. Charles shrugged and said, "Even in the old era, there were bad people, right? I'm just more adaptable than most people." Kevin shook his head. "It's not the same. You've adapted to this era too quickly." Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. Kevin was obviously good at reading people. What he had said about adaptation was true. Charles knew his performance was too ruthless, and it wasn't entirely surprising that some perceptive people had sensed there was something suspicious about him. He suspected that Olivia, too, had her suspicions about him. She, however, kept her thoughts to herself. He didn't want to start a fight with Kevin, so he quickly tried to suggest an alternative reason for his coldness. "Maybe it has something to do with my parents," he suggested. Kevin was suddenly more attentive. "I heard about your parents," he said. "They seem interesting too. They were ordinary farmers who were sent to the military's laboratory, right?" "Do you think the military would let farmers into an important place like their lab?" Charles asked. "Of course not. Kevin replied with a laugh. So, your parents have secret identities then? Yes, Charles said simply. They're researchers in a biochemical lab. He shared some important points about what he knew of his parents' work and left the rest to Kevin's imagination. Kevin processed the information. I see, he said finally. You try to look tough, but you spend every day in fear. No wonder you adapted so quickly. Kevin realized that if Charles's family was involved with biochemical research data and harbored secrets that might prompt an international company to hunt them down, it would certainly explain why Charles was so mistrustful of everyone. His parents had obviously had no choice but to hide their identities. Charles would, therefore, need to be proficient at giving nothing away in case he was interrogated for information. It was natural he would want to keep their identities secret. When Charles saw that Kevin had bought his story, he breathed a quiet sigh of relief. He trusted Kevin's integrity. He was sure that it was higher than his own. He was pleased that by exposing some of his past, he could not only throw Kevin off the scent, but also appear to trust him with personal information. After his bad experience with Elliot, Charles was hesitant to get too close to anyone, least of all new people who could potentially betray him in a heartbeat. He and Elliot had been friends for years, and he and Kevin had not known each other for long. Kevin was pleased that Charles had confided in him, and he felt he had a better understanding of who Charles was. Don't tell Lena about this, will you? Charles asked. She knows that our parents are researchers, but she doesn't know they ever did anything wrong. I know she gets anxious about morality sometimes, and I don't want her thinking badly of our parents. Kevin nodded. I understand, he said. He was slightly amused. Everything he had learned about Charles in the past had been through Lena. She was the person who was closest to him in the world, and she was equally protective of him. Olivia approached Charles and reported softly, There are a load of families and people with children who want to join. What should we do? Charles was stunned. People with children are better suited to join the military's programs, he said curtly. If they need to take care of their children, they can't devote the time necessary to our cause. Also, children are a burden here. The military has implemented some harsh regulations now, she replied. Every person, regardless of age, must follow the military's rules if they want to be protected. They say everyone must participate in the construction of trenches. Their new rules are unbearable for many people. They're treating people like soldiers. Charles understood. The military had treated people too well in the beginning and hadn't required people to help them at the front line. Now, people had grown accustomed to the military doing everything for them. He considered that the military should have had regular people fight initially and not wait until they had to recruit vulnerable people. Now it seemed as though they were being unreasonable. Charles shrugged. If they can't work, why should we take them in? He asked. Can they fight? When it came to regular people, other than enemies and family members, Charles grouped people into two categories: those with value and those without. If people could work, Charles didn't mind taking them in. He disapproved of the work that the military had arranged for them to do. Digging trenches was a tiring waste of time, and he used up too much energy for people whose only sustenance was meager military rations. They had evidently decided it was too difficult to evacuate large groups of people, so instead, they had decided to dig some bunkers to protect as many as possible. Kevin interjected. You're missing the point, he said. They might be useful to us. They're people with a lot to lose. Are you crazy? Charles replied. They consume food and resources. Families don't want to do manual labor. What can we possibly offer them? It's not that they don't want to do manual labor, Kevin argued. They just don't want their kids to get hurt. They don't want them digging trenches or becoming cannon fodder. If we promise to keep their kids safe, we might be able to convince the parents to work twice as hard. Charles frowned slightly. I don't think it's as simple as that, he said. He thought that what Kevin was suggesting was a little extreme. He understood that no one wanted their children digging trenches or ending up dead on the front line. Obviously, parents were worried that the military wanted to use them as chess pieces, so they had searched for an alternative. But even if it was true that they would work, Charles didn't want to use them. He sought people who were ambitious and had the desire to fight. He didn't want to blackmail desperate people who felt they had no other option. He would rather select suitable people who wanted to do the work than try to manipulate someone who felt obligated. I don't like suggesting this kind of thing, Kevin said hesitantly. But the Neal family is very good at training servants. After all, it's how our family has operated for years, and it's not like we're mistreating them. We're just offering them a way to earn their keep. When Charles considered Kevin's point, he suddenly cast his mind to the Neal family's servants. It was true the family had a lot of people who weren't battle-worthy, but they did have many loyal servants and personal security guards. But Charles had his doubts about whether Kevin had enough experience to set up such a system. "Are you really willing to make people do that?" he asked. "I don't want to," Kevin clarified. "I want all our followers to be fighters, but I'm offering an alternative for people who can't. Besides, you wouldn't have to worry about anything. They'd be working for me, not you. Your conscience would be clear." Kevin knew that Charles hadn't been raised with staff, so he could see why he was hesitant. And he saw how the system had the potential to create a hierarchy and all the drama that would entail. But he maintained it was a valid option. If Charles felt uncomfortable, he didn't have to be part of it. The idea was more a question of principles than trust. Olivia smiled and said, "You may not know this, Kevin, but when the Dawn Alliance was established, Charles had never met any paranormals other than the 6 Deputy Alliance leaders. He didn't even ask soldiers' names. He's never asked about the recruitment process at all." Kevin was surprised. "How'd you manage to win people over then?" he asked Charles. "By showing them I was the most powerful person in the room," Charles said honestly. "People are attracted to power, so you see, in a way, it's similar to what you're proposing. But I don't think we'll have to worry about the issues that come with having a hierarchy before we've dealt with the issue of survival." Charles wasn't too worried about Kevin establishing himself as part of a ruling class. He trusted that Kevin wouldn't let power go to his head, and that he would retain their alliance because it was the most logical thing to do. If Charles hadn't known the future, he might have been more worried about the power structure. But he knew that people would soon have much bigger problems than social hierarchy. Kevin and Charles shook hands. "All right," said Charles. "Let's build a true home for the survivors." At that moment, someone approached Olivia. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's someone looking for you. She said she's your sister." "Miranda!" Olivia exclaimed. "I'll be right there," she assured the messenger. "Can you start the preparations?" Charles asked Kevin. "I want to meet an old friend." Kevin nodded. Then he gathered a few military surveillance personnel and several trusted family aides to assist Olivia's subordinates with the recruitment process. Charles followed Olivia until they saw several familiar figures, including Olivia and Anthony. When Miranda saw Olivia, she ran over and hugged her. Tears rushed down her face. "I heard that you were attacked by bugs," she cried. "I thought that something awful had happened to you." Olivia cried too. When she and Miranda had last parted, it had been in the wake of an argument. In the heat of the moment, they had both seemingly forgotten the fact that they lived in an era of uncertainty and death, and both harbored regrets that they had left each other on such bad terms. When Anthony saw Charles, he rushed over excitedly and shook his hand. "Charles, you're here too," he said happily. He affected a funny, nonchalant tone. "I haven't heard from you in a long time. I assumed you were dead." Charles pretended to be angry. "Did you really have such little faith in me?" he joked. "Now look at me. I have a whole alliance. You see how wrong you were to doubt me?" "We came here a few times," Anthony told him. "Last time we were only told that the leader here was elusive. I should have guessed it was you." He stuck out his tongue. Both of them laughed, but Charles was also surprised. It appeared that Anthony and Miranda had been to the fortress more than once, but they had seemingly missed him every time. If it hadn't been for the bug swarm, he realized that they might have never met again. He couldn't regret his choices, though, because if he hadn't helped the military in Ohio, he wouldn't have found his sister so quickly. And perhaps he wouldn't have been able to save her in time. He marveled at the interesting nature of fate. Zach and the others also found Charles and began to reminisce with him. Miranda took the lead, and she and the others helped the refugees settle in. She explained that she had wanted to be of as much help as possible, so while they had been out searching for supplies, they tried their best to help as many survivors as they could. However, it appeared that neither Zach nor Miranda was as naive as they had been in the past. Many of the people they had met had been difficult to teach and inflexible when faced with change. Many people had agreed to follow them back to the fortress and were grateful for the help. But it seemed that both Zach and Miranda had found the process harrowing, and they had suffered their own instances of being stabbed in the back by people they were only trying to help. This had resulted in numerous fights where they had taken out several people to protect the rest. Charles found himself respecting Miranda even more for this. He had always thought that she had the character of a saint, and that she might struggle in the new era, but her newfound worldliness suited her, and she seemed more self-assured and capable than ever. Miranda didn't have a discriminating bone in her body. She thought that everyone deserved a chance, regardless of their circumstances, and she was kind and responsible. But she'd more recently learned that it was important not to allow people to take advantage of her kindness. She had no qualms anymore about protecting herself and others from unscrupulous people by any means necessary. Charles approved of this mentality, and he no longer worried that she might not survive. It would have been difficult to allow such a soft-hearted person to be part of the upper echelon of the Alliance. Miranda's newfound pragmatism eased his worries. Charles told Zach and Anthony about his plans. "I want to build a survival base," he told them, "where people can sleep peacefully under the protection of an energy barrier. It'll have its own ecological cycle and protect people." Anthony, who had a great deal of respect for Charles, said, "All right, I'm on board. Whatever you want to do, Charles, I support you. If you know a place we can go, I'll be there." If it hadn't been for Charles's insistence, Anthony would have followed him from the start. He'd been willing to help him find his sister, but Charles had been worried that Miranda might face danger, so he'd asked him to accompany her. Dale and Calvin were also quick to voice their thoughts after they discussed the matter between themselves. "We want to come," Dale said, "but we'll follow Miranda." They had become accustomed to following Miranda's orders, and they had more loyalty to her than Charles. They were both interested in hearing her opinion before they committed to leaving. Charles noticed that Zach was frowning slightly. "Do you have any concerns?" he asked. He had thought an introvert like Zach would have been the most willing person of all to join a safe haven, like the one he had proposed. He was confused about why he seemed so worried. Zach said seriously, "At my level, I'm far from being able to establish an energy shield. If you give me a little time, I might be able to make it happen. Even though I'm worried if I try to produce one, I'll make a mistake." Charles was speechless. If he didn't know Zach, he would have thought the statement was a humble brag. He had originally saved Zach because he had taken pity on him, but he hadn't expected him to be a genius. Knowing now what a true talent he was, Charles was pleased he had made the call to save him. If what Zach said was true, it was likely his strength was slightly below that of some of the top powers in the new era, including the Tungsten League. The only thing that differentiated him from the Advanced League of Fighters seemed to be his temperament and outlook. Charles had only met one other person with the talent to equal the Tungsten League, and that was Lewis. He suspected Kevin might also be close, but Kevin's path in the new era had deviated vastly from that in Charles's previous life, and he was unsure what the future had in store for him. Seeing everyone's gobsmacked faces, Calvin assured them all, "We have many crystal cores, but our team's allocation has always been evenly distributed. Zach's natural talent is clearly impressive compared to the rest of us." No one knew what to say. All of them wondered how he had managed to achieve such strength. However, they had all faced death together several times, and Zach was such an amazing person that none of them could be jealous of him. Charles finally found his voice. "It's all right," he assured Zach. "I'll establish the energy shield. When you do reach Tier 5, you can help me maintain it." Zach heaved a sigh of relief. "That's great," he said happily. Calvin and Dale looked at Charles in surprise. "You've reached Tier 5? Calvin asked. Anthony clutched his heart in feigned shock. "Do you enjoy giving me a heart attack?" he joked. "Zach's our resident know-it-all, thanks, so you can stop making us all look bad." Charles laughed and said, "I'm only at the peak of Tier 3, don't worry." However, this revelation seemed to make everyone even more uneasy. Their minds were flooded with concerns. If a Tier 3 could establish an energy shield, it meant that they weren't all awakening at the same rate. They had all witnessed Charles's power. No matter what kind of opponent he faced, he always had a corresponding technique. It was as if he had more power than he could ever use. The only one who seemed unfazed by Charles's statement was Zach. He didn't take any pride in being stronger than others, nor did he feel inferior or jealous that Charles was more powerful than him. He was simply happy for his friend. If that's the case, Can you imagine the number of people we can save together? He exclaimed excitedly. Charles stopped himself from sighing at Zach's well-meaning statement. He considered how lucky it was he and Miranda had met Zach before anyone else. Someone with so much compassion wasn't likely to live long in the post-apocalyptic world, no matter what strength they possessed. There was also the possibility that he could have been used by others, or else become someone's hired thug. Meanwhile, Miranda and Olivia reconnected and put an end to their argument. Miranda explained that when she had heard her cousin's fortress had been attacked by a swarm of insects, and that there had been countless casualties, she'd rushed back without stopping. On her way, she had sworn to herself that if Olivia was still alive, she would fix their relationship and any misunderstanding between them. She vowed that nothing would separate them again. Charles took the opportunity to tell Miranda his ideas. "You've saved a lot of people," he said appreciatively, "but you've seen how it is here. Even though the military built us a fortress, it's not completely safe. I want to build somewhere that is. It'll be a survival base, just like in the movies. It'll stop people from living in fear all day. I know it won't change what's happening outside, but at least people will be able to sleep soundly knowing they aren't going to be attacked in the night." Miranda was moved by Charles's words. "Okay," she said. "It's clear that we aren't saving anyone by bringing them to an unsecured location. It's a waste of effort. But first, I want you to promise me one thing. I want to designate a certain amount of space in the base for new people. I won't give up searching for survivors." "I also have a condition," Charles countered. "All survivors have to accept the rules of the base. There has to be an even division of labor. The survival base doesn't provide for idle people." Miranda smiled. "Of course," she agreed. She had met many people with bad intentions, and she understood the reasoning behind Charles's rule. However, even though she had seen worse in people, she still loved the world, her country, and her identity as a human being. She was proud of it. No amount of darkness could wash away the light in her heart. No matter how long the darkness continued, she would never give up her humanity. The night came quickly. At 3 in the afternoon, the sun was still high in the sky, but heavy clouds rolled in and blotted out the sun. It seemed to many that even the sun had given up on the world. "Is this dark elemental energy?" Charles muttered to himself. Alice overheard him. "What's dark elemental energy?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing," he replied. "Tell everyone to prepare for battle. There are more bugs outside the city. Once the sky gets dark enough, the bugs will attack." There were many types of bugs. They were mainly active during the night, although several species did appear during the day. The number of bugs active during the day, though, was easily controlled. What concerned many was that the insects seemed to have a higher than average level of intelligence. They waited outside the fortress for the best time to attack. The army's reinforcements would take some time to arrive, so the military, who couldn't evacuate people, prepared for a battle. Some people in the fortress had taken the risk to look for other fortresses during the day, while others, like Charles, had taken the opportunity to expand their forces. Charles fortified the city walls with the power of thunder. He used dozens of light beams to form a shield that contained several small gaps. Light beams peeked through the holes and ensured people could see the approaching bugs. When Charles's protections proved effective, the Alliance burst into cheers. "The bugs can't get in!" someone cried. "Don't celebrate too soon," Charles warned them. "The energy of these light screens is limited. It does keep us all safe, but we still have to kill the bugs." He knew they couldn't rely solely on the energy shields to defend them against the swarm, so he left deliberate gaps in the shields. That way, he could control the location and quantity of the bugs. Olivia began to give orders. "Everyone, divide into the teams you were assigned during the day," she said. "Each team will guard an entrance. If you encounter ordinary bugs, let ordinary people kill them. Paranormals will preserve their strength and deal with the more powerful ones. Wind-type paranormals will manipulate the bugs' flight patterns." Although the ordinary people and the paranormals frequently clashed, they all knew they needed to rely on each other to survive. Everyone followed Olivia's orders without question or complaint. Kevin and some Tier 4 paranormals positioned themselves front and center, ready to take the lead in destroying the more powerful bugs when they came through the shields. Soon, the bugs launched their first attack. The protective shield made the defense easy. The ordinary bugs were taken out, and not many people were injured. Those who were sustained only superficial wounds. Once they repelled the first wave of bugs, everyone burst into cheers. "We won! Long live Charles! With him around, we'll take out every monster!" Compared to the first attack they had suffered, where bugs had come crawling from every direction, the current situation seemed like heaven. Miranda looked at the crowd of over 10,000 people and smiled at Olivia. "I'd love to lead people the way you do," she said. "I've saved a lot of people, but I can't organize them to protect themselves the way you can." She felt she had gained a better understanding of her cousin's work. Olivia might be an ambitious person, but she still helped people immensely, whether or not that was her intention. Miranda considered that it was possible for someone to do good without using kindness as their driving force. "Without Charles's protective shield," Olivia said, "I'm afraid my command wouldn't be very effective." Anthony looked around and sniffed the air curiously. "Where's Charles?" he asked. "And what smells so good?" They followed the scent, and it led them to Charles. He was cooking something that smelled amazing in a large pot on a stove. "It's just some rice with meat," Charles explained. "It's time to change our defense. Tell those who fought first to retreat and rest. They can have some hot food and recover their strength." Olivia's mouth watered slightly, then she ordered her men to distribute the food. There was an immediate outpouring of praise. "I haven't eaten anything hot in weeks. I've been eating nothing but rations for months. Salt! There's salt and meat in here. This is the most delicious thing I've tasted in my life. Remember when you could have this whenever you wanted?" Although the people who joined the Dawn Alliance never wanted for food, most of it was canned, or consisted mainly of bread. When they tasted the meal, everyone was excited. Most of them relied on the rations distributed by the military. Although they never starved, it was a miserable existence. It was incredible that a mouthful of meat and rice could provide so much joy. Most of them hadn't realized before the apocalypse just how precious food was. Seeing everyone's smiles made Miranda happy. She had wondered recently whether she would ever see true joy again. Now the flame of hope in her heart burned brighter than it had in a long time. Then someone was foolish enough to try and snatch somebody else's food. Olivia quickly had the thief caught and banished without asking any questions. She knew that showing mercy would set a bad precedent, and she wanted to keep people's spirits up and reward those who had fought against the bugs. She said sternly, "Only those who contribute to the defense will share the hot food. The only reason we have it at all is because they risk their own lives to protect everyone's safety. If you want some, go kill some bugs. There are plenty of groups defending the gate who need more people." Everyone spoke over each other in excitement. "I want to participate. I'll help the defense. I want to kill bugs!" Olivia shouted louder than all of them. "Those who can't follow orders will get no food," she told them. Instantly, the camp was silent.